I'm Ethan Carter, 33. And you know what's funny? It took being thrown out by my family at 19 to finally understand that success isn't about pleasing them, it's about surviving them. The last time my parents spoke to me, they called me a directionless disappointment. 9 years later, I walked into the grandest ballroom in Chicago, not as the broken boy they discarded, but as the CEO of a company whose name they didn't even recognize. The best part, they were right there in that gilded hall, blissfully unaware of the reckoning about to unfold. But before we dive in, if you've ever been underestimated by your own family, hit that like button and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I'd love to hear your stories too. All right, let me set the scene. The Carter family always dreamt of belonging to the city's elite. Charity galas, marble foyers, whispered stock tips over brandy. They worshipped that world from the sidelines. And here they were tonight at the prestigious Hayworth Foundation Gala, pretending they belonged, brushing shoulders with old money they could never quite impress. And me, I was there as a guest of honor, thanks to Clara, my brilliant wife, a biomedical researcher whose work had saved countless lives. Her family ran the Hayworth Foundation. My company, BioCore Labs, was the event's headline sponsor. None of that mattered to my parents, of course. To them, I would always be the lazy kid who refused law school, the rebel who worked a dozen low-paying jobs while real people like my brother Chase climbed corporate ladders. I was straightening my tie in the hall outside the main ballroom when I heard that voice that could still send ice down my spine. "Is that Ethan?" My mother, Veronica, hissing through gritted teeth as she tugged on my father's sleeve. "What's that failure doing here? My God, he's contaminating the air in this place." For a second, I was 19 again, backpack slung over my shoulder, standing on the front porch as my father slammed the door shut behind me. No warning, no goodbye. Just exile. My father Robert didn't even bother looking over. "Ignore him," he muttered. "Probably catering staff. He'll slink away if we don't acknowledge him." But my younger brother Chase couldn't resist. He sauntered up to me, martini in hand, smug smile in place. Chase was their golden boy, polished, perfect, shallow. "Well, well," he drawled loud enough for a few heads to turn. "Look who wandered in. What's the matter Ethan lost on your way to the coat check? Caterings? In the back, buddy." I didn't flinch. I had built walls around my heart long before tonight. My smile was cool, calculated. "The world's a small place, Chase," I said quietly. "You might want to be careful who you try to humiliate. You never know who's holding the strings." He chuckled, missing the warning completely. Before he could reply, 2 more people joined us. His fiancée, Dr. Madison Green, a surgeon with an inflated ego to match her credentials, and Dr. David Lang, chief of surgery at St. Vincent's where Madison worked, and Chase's new father-in-law-to-be. David nodded politely to me at first, but then his expression shifted. Recognition. Fear. He knew exactly who I was. He had seen my company's name in his hospital's supplier contracts. Meanwhile, Chase was oblivious, already prepping his next cutting remark. Then came the announcement, "Dr. Madison Green, please join us on stage to receive this year's Rising Star in Medicine Award." My parents clapped enthusiastically. Their soon-to-be daughter-in-law was their newest golden prize. As Madison strutted to the stage, I felt Clara slip her arm into mine. Her calm, steady warmth kept me anchored. "Are you okay?" she asked, searching my face. I met her gaze, finding in her the only validation I ever needed. "We're not leaving," I said. "Not tonight." My mother noticed Clara for the first time. Her gaze sharpened, predatory. "Oh, look," she sneered. "He found himself a meal ticket. She doesn't know what she's in for." I let her words wash over me. They couldn't touch me anymore. But something deeper stirred. A memory. I was 10, clutching a cracked ceramic bowl in our kitchen, the one Chase had knocked from the counter during one of his tantrums. My mother didn't ask what happened. She didn't care. "Clean it up," she'd said, voice flat. "Maybe you'll learn to be more careful next time." I cleaned it up, all right. I cleaned up every mess they left behind in ways they never even noticed. And tonight, their carefully curated world was about to unravel, and they didn't even know I was holding the thread. The applause swelled as Madison Green climbed onto the stage, basking in the glow of borrowed admiration. My family beamed with pride, their eyes shining, feeding on the reflected glory of their soon-to-be daughter-in-law's moment. The irony was bitter but beautiful. They didn't know the woman they were applauding had built her rising star on my work, my research, my long-forgotten sacrifice. Clara's fingers curled tighter around mine, grounding me. She didn't say a word. She didn't have to. In that simple touch was everything solidarity, love, and permission. Permission not to run this time. I stayed standing in the back of the room watching as Madison thanked her mentors, my father included, and listening to how effortlessly she performed the role of brilliant, humble prodigy. She was good at this game. But I had learned that the higher people climb on stolen ladders, the harder they fall when the ladder burns, and I was holding the match. While polite applause followed her last words, my eyes wandered back to Chase. He was leaning against a marble pillar drink in hand, looking smug and untouchable. He thought this night belonged to him. He thought he was untouchable because he'd learned all the wrong lessons from my parents, that charm could replace substance, that arrogance looked like confidence if you dressed it in a three-piece suit. But there's a dangerous truth. Chase never learned a truth that shaped me long after they discarded me like trash. When you grow up unwanted, invisible, constantly underestimated, you start noticing everything. Every word, every hesitation, every slip. The powerless often see what the powerful miss entirely. The waiter passed with a tray of champagne, and I took a glass purely for something to hold to disguise the tremor running through me. This was it. The culmination of nearly a decade of quiet labor nights spent studying in library corners. I wasn't allowed to belong in weekends building prototypes from salvaged equipment in my one-room studio apartment. Every moment of being ignored, belittled, patronized, it all led here. I caught sight of Dr. David Lang Madison's father as he crossed the ballroom. His face was taut. The mask was slipping. He'd recognized me the instant we'd locked eyes earlier. And he knew what I knew. Madison's award tonight was hollow, built on technology developed by BioCore Labs. My work, my patents. He avoided looking at me now, kept his gaze fixed on the floor as he muttered something to his assistant. It was almost amusing. Almost. And yet, despite all this righteousness burning in my chest, a question gnawed at me. Could I really do this? Could I pull the pin and watch their whole social facade collapse in front of 1,000 witnesses? Could I shame them the way they had shamed me? But as that doubt crept in, a memory cut through, a razor-sharp echo from the past. I was 20, standing in a dusty garage where I slept after they'd thrown me out, reading my mother's words, scrawled in perfect cursive on a birthday card she'd mailed me 2 weeks late. You have no direction. Maybe one day you'll grow up and stop embarrassing us. That was their love. Conditional, performative, withholding. That card was the last thing I ever kept from them. I burned it that night in a coffee can behind the garage, but the message stayed with me, branded into my bones. It was fuel now. Across the room, Clara's father, William Hayworth, the man hosting this entire evening, stepped to the podium. His presence was commanding without being ostentatious, a quiet power that made people listen without realizing they were being led. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, his rich voice reverberating across the marble walls. Thank you for joining us tonight as we honor innovation in medicine. But tonight's true innovation didn't come from where you might think. There it was, the opening, the moment where everything could pivot. My pulse thundered in my ears. I glanced at Chase again. He wasn't paying attention. He was texting, probably lining up his next smug one-liner. My parents whispered conspiratorially, basking in their proximity to success that wasn't theirs, but which they clung to like barnacles on a yacht. William continued. In fact, tonight's highest honor, the Visionary Award, goes to an individual who quietly transformed the field of post-surgical recovery through advanced biotherapeutic nutrition. The room began to stir. My parents tilted their heads. Chase finally put down his phone, suddenly curious, and then the knife slipped between their ribs. This man's company, BioCore Labs, now supplies nearly half the country's top hospitals, including our own, William announced. A leader, an innovator, and yes, my son-in-law. The words hit like thunder, silencing the crowd for a breathless instant before curiosity swelled into murmurs. My mother's face paled visibly as she processed the son-in-law part confusion blooming into dread. Chase blinked rapidly, lips parting but no words coming. But William wasn't finished. Tonight, I am proud to present the Hayworth Foundation's highest honor to Mr. Ethan Carter. A spotlight snapped to life, searing straight onto me. And in that instant, every head in that room turned, including theirs, including Chase's, my mother's, my father's. Their expressions were portraits painted in horror, disbelief, and something else, vulnerability. I felt Clara's hand in mine, her voice soft but electric in my ear. "This is your moment. Take it." As I stepped forward, glass in hand, champagne untouched, I felt none of the anger I thought I'd feel. No cruelty, no vindictive glee, just clarity. Pure, sharp clarity. The power dynamics had flipped, but the moment felt bigger than revenge. This was about truth, a truth they could no longer deny or rewrite. The applause washed over me, distant and surreal. But inside I felt rooted solid in a way I never had before. And as I crossed that marble floor, my mind already turning to what would come next. A confrontation, a reckoning. I realized this was just the beginning. The sound of my name echoed like a thunderclap through the ballroom, louder than the applause that followed. Every eye was on me, but I wasn't looking at the crowd. I was looking straight at Chase, at my mother, at my father. The Carter family tableau was frozen glasses, mid-air, smiles half-formed and behind their eyes. A dawning horror. The son they had erased, the one they decided wasn't worthy of their last name, was now standing under a spotlight holding the room's attention in the palm of his hand. As I walked toward the stage, memories flickered not as warm nostalgia, but like sharp glass underfoot. Sitting on that hard bench outside the house as my father locked the front door. The sound of my mother's voice when she told me, "We simply can't carry you anymore, Ethan." The sting of Chase's laughter as he watched me leave with a trash bag holding all my belongings. I had been cast out like garbage, and now I was walking back into their world on my own terms in front of their entire social circle. Clara's father, William Hayworth, met me at the foot of the stage with a smile that was both proud and knowing. He didn't need to say a word. He knew this was more than an award. It was the quiet culmination of something I'd been building in silence for a decade. I shook his hand firmly, feeling the weight of the crystal award as he passed it to me. It was heavy, but I carried far heavier burdens before this night. I stepped up to the microphone, my mind clear, my voice steady. The lights were hot, but I felt cold inside, a purposeful, focused kind of cold. I could feel Clara's gaze from across the room, warm and unwavering, her silent encouragement rooting me where I stood. I began to speak not from notes, not from a prepared script, but from truth. I want to thank the Hayworth Foundation for this incredible honor. It's surreal to stand here tonight knowing where this journey began, I said, pausing just enough to let the moment breathe. You see, this journey didn't begin in a lab or a lecture hall. It began at a moment of rejection. A ripple passed through the crowd, small, almost imperceptible. But I knew that somewhere at the back of the room, my family was leaning in now, realizing that this wasn't just an acceptance speech. It was something else entirely. I continued, keeping my tone calm, reflective, but deliberate. Rejection teaches you things that success never can. It teaches you resilience. It teaches you that when doors are slammed in your face, you don't just walk away, you find a way to build your own door. I wasn't calling them out directly, not yet, but I was threading the needle carefully. This was more than revenge. This was a masterclass in grace under fire, in turning humiliation into dignity. And I was delivering it calmly, without venom, but with a precision that could only come from years of healing and distance. The innovations we've achieved at BioCore Labs weren't born out of privilege or easy pathways, I went on. They were born out of necessity. When you've been told you're not good enough, when you've been discarded, You learn to build everything from scratch: your career, your confidence, your community. I caught Chase's eyes then, and for a brief second, his smirk faltered. He understood finally that I was speaking directly to them, to the history they thought I would never dare bring into this gilded room. My mother's lips were pinched tight, her posture rigid. My father's face was unreadable but pale. The applause came at all the expected moments, but I could sense that the atmosphere was shifting. The audience wasn't just hearing a success story, they were witnessing a reckoning disguised as an award speech. As I neared the end, I introduced a carefully placed symbol, a nod to something they couldn't possibly miss. "I want to dedicate this award tonight," I said slowly, "to all those who've been told they don't belong, to those who know what it's like to be the outsider even within your own family. You don't just survive that kind of rejection, you transform because of it." The applause roared louder this time, and as I stepped down from the podium, the cameras flashing, I didn't look back at my parents or Chase. I didn't need to. They were no longer the axis of my existence, they were part of the landscape I had crossed to get here. But this night wasn't over yet. I still had one more step to take, and it would require risk, courage, and a calculated move that would change everything. After the ceremony, as the crowd drifted into the cocktail reception, I moved deliberately toward my family's table. Clara was at my side, her grip steady but gentle. She didn't try to stop me. She understood that this was something I had to do. As I approached, I saw the panic in my mother's eyes, the stiffness in my father's jaw, and the defensive hostility in Chase's stance. Madison, Chase's fiancée, looked genuinely confused. She hadn't yet put the pieces together that her entire professional reputation was built on a stolen idea. Ethan Chase started tone dripping with fake warmth. "Congratulations. I didn't realize you'd made something of yourself after all." His attempt to regain control was pathetic. I didn't bite. Instead, I smiled, a real smile this time, not forced or brittle. "Thanks, Chase," I said simply. "Actually, I wanted to let you all know that BioCore Labs is launching a new initiative this quarter. We're establishing a scholarship fund for students from disadvantaged backgrounds who've been underestimated. You know, kids who weren't given the support they deserved." I held their gaze as I spoke, letting the weight of my words settle like a stone in water. Then I added, "And we're naming it the Carter Resilience Fund." I thought it was a fitting tribute. For a moment, my mother's breath hitched. The insult was clear, but delivered with perfect civility dressed up as philanthropy. This was the language of their world after all. Appearances, legacies, names etched into plaques. But this plaque would tell a different story. A story of overcoming their abandonment, not embodying their values. But I wasn't done. I turned slightly to Madison, addressing her directly for the first time. "By the way, Dr. Green, you might want to check your upcoming contracts. St. Vincent's will be switching suppliers next month. BioCore Labs will no longer be supporting your department's initiatives." Her smile froze, eyes widening. She glanced at her father, David Lang, who was standing a few feet away, pale and stiff. She realized in that instant that her rising star was now on shaky ground. The platform she thought she was standing on had been built by me, and I had just pulled out the support beams. The symbolic twist wasn't just professional, it was personal. I wasn't here to ruin their lives. I was here to expose the rot they had built them on. But the risk was real too. By making this public declaration, I was inviting scrutiny, ensuring that Madison Chase and David Lang would feel the heat of accountability. It was a calculated gamble, but the truth was on my side, and I wasn't afraid. As I straightened my jacket and prepared to walk away, Chase's voice cut through the air, loud, sharp, panicked. "You think this changes anything? You're still a dropout, Ethan. You'll always be the failure who couldn't even finish school." His words were desperate, a man drowning, reaching for any lifeline. But he didn't understand I wasn't drowning anymore. I was the tide. I paused, then turned back, leaning in slightly so only he and my parents could hear. "The funny thing is," I said softly, "you were all so busy judging me for not finishing college. You didn't notice that I spent those years building something real. While you were posturing, I was working. And while you were dismissing me, I was learning how this world actually works. And then with a final nod to Clara, I left them sitting there adrift in a sea of their own bitterness and confusion. I didn't need their acceptance. I never had. The applause outside the bubble of their disdain was louder, warmer, and more genuine than anything they could have given me. As Clara and I stepped out onto the balcony for some fresh air, the night air was crisp and bracing. The city stretched out below us, glittering and alive. For the first time in years, I felt light. Not just victorious, but free. But this wasn't the end. There was still one piece of unfinished business. The Carter name was on that scholarship fund now, but my next move would ensure that their legacy wouldn't just be tarnished. It would be rewritten entirely. And as I stood there feeling the cold air on my skin, I realized with sudden clarity, I wasn't just reclaiming my place at their table. I was building a new one, and they'd have no seat at it. Back inside the ballroom was buzzing, but I felt strangely calm, like the eye of a storm I'd spent years navigating. I'd spoken my truth, reclaimed my name, and dismantled the illusions my family had clung to. But there was something deeper at play tonight, something even I hadn't expected. Freedom didn't feel like revenge. It felt like absence. The absence of their grip on me. The absence of needing to prove myself. I could almost taste it. Clara stayed close, quietly observing her presence, both comforting and sharp. A reminder that I had chosen this path and walked it alone, but I wasn't alone anymore. We found a quiet corner near a marble column where a small group of influential physicians and executives were gathered, whispering urgently. Among them was Dr. Patricia Wallace, chair of St. Vincent's board, a woman whose word could tilt careers overnight. Her sharp, intelligent eyes found mine instantly. "Mr. Carter," she said, offering her hand. "Or should I call you Ethan?" Her grip was firm, her tone laced with curiosity and a hint of caution. "You've made quite an impression tonight." I met her gaze evenly. "I've spent a long time being invisible," I said, keeping my voice low but intentional. It was overdue. She smiled, but it wasn't just polite. It was respectful. Real. BioCore's products are exceptional. We'd be foolish not to strengthen our relationship moving forward, especially in light of certain revelations tonight. Her glance drifted almost imperceptibly across the room to where Madison Green stood pale and stricken, caught in an awkward conversation with her father, David Lang. The cracks were showing already. But I didn't gloat. This was never just about revenge on them, it was about justice. About peeling back the polite veneer that hid deeper rot, the kind that infected institutions and people alike. Nepotism, entitlement, privilege, masking mediocrity. As we spoke, Chase drifted nearby, desperate for some foothold to recover dignity. His charm had evaporated. For once he was silent, a study in exposed fragility. I didn't look his way. The only person whose approval had mattered for too long was now irrelevant. Even as I negotiated this next phase with Wallace, my mind kept drifting not toward them, but toward me. What came next had to be real, not reactionary. I didn't just want to survive them. I wanted to build something better than they could have ever imagined. But the night wasn't done testing me. Just as I was preparing to leave, a hand caught my arm. My father, Robert Carter. His face, so familiar and yet so foreign, was twisted into something I hadn't seen before, desperation. "Ethan," he said, voice low and uneven. "Can we talk privately?" I almost laughed at the audacity. Years of silence, of exile, of scorn, and now he wanted to talk. But there was something in his eyes that stopped me. Not guilt exactly, but fear. Real fear. It intrigued me, and I was no longer running from these confrontations. "All right," I said simply. Clara's gaze met mine, questioning but trusting. I nodded once wordless assurance and followed him out onto one of the smaller stone terraces away from the crowd and the lights. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The cold night air carried a faint tang of lake water and city smog swirling around us like ghosts. Finally, he exhaled sharply. "You're different than I expected," he said. I tilted my head, curiosity genuine. Expected what? A failure. A beggar looking for scraps? His jaw tightened. That's not fair. The words rang hollow. Fair, I repeated softly. You threw me out before I was 20, Dad. You watched Chase mock me, you and Mom both. You pretended I didn't exist for a decade. He swallowed hard, rubbing his hands together as if the cold were the reason he couldn't speak clearly. We didn't think you'd make it. The admission landed like a dull thud. Not regret, not apology, just calculation. They had bet against me and lost. And now he was scrambling to rewrite the narrative to make this look like an inevitable Carter redemption arc, rather than the reality that I had rebuilt myself in spite of them, not because of them. His next words confirmed it. You know there's an opportunity here for reconciliation, he ventured. For the family name. For us to work together. I felt a quiet rage stir, but not the fiery kind. The cold, clear, crystalline kind. The kind forged from understanding exactly what this man was doing. He didn't care about me. He cared about optics, about legacy, about reclaiming a lost son as a corporate asset. Robert, I said deliberately, using his first name, this isn't about the family name. It's about mine. My name. My work. My company. He flinched, but only slightly. Your mother's inside crying, he added, trying another angle. She never stopped worrying about you. I met his gaze evenly. She never called, Dad. Not once. Not when I was couch surfing. Not when I was sick and couldn't afford a doctor. Not when I launched my first product. She never called. Neither did you. Silence stretched between us, thick, heavy, honest. And then the twist. I know about the Carter Resilience Fund, he said, his voice sharp now. You used our name without asking. You think that won't affect us? There it was. The real fear. Not shame, not familial regret, brand damage, reputation. I smiled, but this time it wasn't bitter. It was calm, rooted, inevitable. Oh, it will affect you, I said, stepping closer. But not in the way you think. You see, this isn't just a scholarship fund. It's a story, a symbol, a lesson for every kid who ever sat at a dinner table wondering why their family didn't love them as they were. His face paled further. You're making us the villains. I shrugged lightly. That's not up to me, Robert. The facts tell the story. You wrote your chapter a long time ago. I'm just publishing it. He shook his head slowly, clearly unused to being powerless in a negotiation. This is reckless, Ethan. You don't understand how these things work. But I did. That was the difference between us now. I understood perfectly how these things worked and why they were falling apart for him. He built his world on performance, on shallow ties, and surface respect. I had built mine on something much harder, one authenticity, failure, resilience. And people, good people, recognized the difference. I didn't need his blessing or his fear anymore. But before I left, I added one more thing, not as cruelty, but as clarity. You should talk to Chase tonight, I said, almost gently. He needs you right now. He's not nearly as invincible as he thinks. He's about to learn that reputation isn't armor. And with that, I left him standing there alone in the cold, while I returned to the ballroom, not triumphant, but peaceful. Clara was waiting for me near the entrance coat draped over her arm. Her eyes scanned my face carefully, searching for cracks. Are you okay? She asked. I nodded slowly. Better than okay, I said. I'm done. But even as I spoke those words, I knew it wasn't over. The final test wasn't theirs anymore, it was mine. I had won the battle for respect. Now I had to win the battle for peace. How do you let go of ghosts you've lived with for so long they feel like part of your skin? That was the next chapter. And as Clara slipped her hand into mine and we stepped out into the night, I realized that freedom comes with a price, the willingness to walk away for good. No explanations, no dramatics. The real question was, could I pay that price? The cool air outside felt cleaner than it had inside the gilded ballroom. I took a deep breath as we stepped onto the curb, the bright city lights glinting off the polished windows around us. Clara hailed a cab, but I held her hand, gently pausing, not quite ready to go home. For all the noise and spectacle of what had just happened, I felt strangely hollow, like I'd walked out of a movie I'd starred in but couldn't remember the plot. Clara noticed. She leaned into me slightly and asked softly, "Are you sure you're okay?" I could only nod because honestly, I didn't know how I felt, not really. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't vindicated either. The satisfaction I thought I would feel had faded into something else entirely: exhaustion. Bone-deep, soul-deep exhaustion. "Walk with me," I asked, and she nodded without hesitation. We left the cab behind and wandered down the quiet streets, our footsteps echoing between the old brick buildings and steel and glass towers. My mind drifted as we walked backward and forward at the same time. I thought about the Carter Resilience Fund and how ironic it was that I'd named it after the very people who had done their best to break me. Symbolic, yes, but also maybe unnecessary. The symbolism had felt sharp and righteous when I'd conceived it. But tonight, after seeing Robert's desperate face, it felt different. Like I was still living on their terms, even in defiance. I glanced over at Clara. She knew me better than anyone. She would sense it soon enough that something unresolved was clawing at me again. But I wasn't ready to talk about it yet. Instead, I let myself think about Chase. He would be reeling after tonight, though his ego wouldn't let him admit it. The cracks in his relationship with Madison would only widen from here. Dr. Patricia Wallace was no fool. She would act quickly to protect her institution's reputation, which meant Madison's professional halo would dim fast, and Chase's entire identity was tied to being attached to people who looked good on paper. I wondered, would he recover? Could he pivot? Did he even have that skill, or was his whole personality too entwined with the Carter mythology we were all raised to believe in? The mythology that said reputation mattered more than integrity. Appearances more than substance. Winning more than learning. Even now, walking these streets with the woman I loved, I could feel that mythology tugging at the corners of my mind. A lifetime of conditioning doesn't vanish just because you prove it wrong. That more than anything was the unfinished business. The external war was over, but the internal one still burned quietly under my skin. Clara finally spoke. "You're thinking about Chase. Not a question, a statement." I smiled, despite myself. "You know me too well," I admitted. "Yeah, I am. I'm wondering what he's going to do next. Whether he falls apart or adapts." Clara was quiet for a moment, then said carefully, "Does it matter? That stopped me cold. Did Chase's future have anything to do with my own peace if I truly wanted to be free? Why did I still care? I didn't have an answer. We stopped in front of an old bookstore, the kind that always smells like paper and history. Its front window was dusty and cluttered, but a small handwritten sign caught my eye. "Sometimes letting go is the bravest thing you'll ever do." The irony wasn't lost on me. I exhaled slowly and turned to Clara. "It's time," I said simply. Time for what she asked. To finish this, I replied, my voice quiet but resolute. Properly, cleanly. We walked back to the apartment in silence, a companionable, necessary silence that let the gravity of the evening settle in. Once home, I went straight to the shelf where I kept a small black box, a box I hadn't opened in years. Inside it were the last artifacts of my life before freedom, the torn envelope from the birthday card my mother had sent me after kicking me out, an old key to their house long since changed, and a photo of Chase and me from when we were kids sitting side by side on the front steps, smiling before everything broke. I held the photo for a long time, studying the way our faces looked back then, innocent, untested, unaware of the fractures to come. Then I turned it over and wrote 2 words on the back in bold ink, "Not mine." That was the truth. That life, the one I had spent so many years grieving, was not mine anymore. Maybe it never had been. I slipped the photo back into the box, shut the lid tight, and carried it to the fireplace. Clara appeared at my side, saying nothing, just placing a comforting hand on my shoulder. Without ceremony, I tossed the entire box onto the flames and watched as it burned. Not in anger, but in release. The fire cracked and popped as paper and plastic and old ghosts turned to ash. I felt lighter, not triumphant, not vindictive, just lighter. And that's when my phone buzzed. A text from Chase. "Come see me tomorrow, please." The word please froze me for a second. Chase never said please. Never. I handed the phone to Clara. She read it, raised an eyebrow, but didn't say what she was thinking. Instead, she asked gently, "Do you want to go?" I didn't know the answer immediately. Part of me wanted to say no, wanted to cut that cord completely now that I was free. But another part, maybe the part that would always be the boy sitting on those steps with his brother, felt something else. Curiosity. Compassion, closure. I turned the phone back over and typed 2 words. Tomorrow, noon. No ceremony, no preamble. Just a simple appointment with the past one final meeting before I could walk away completely. The next morning dawned gray and cold, the sky heavy with low clouds that made the city feel small and hushed. Clara kissed me softly before I left. "You don't have to do this," she said. "I know," I replied. "That's why I can." Chase had asked to meet at a downtown cafe, one of those glass and steel places where people go to pretend they're busy changing the world over overpriced coffee. When I arrived, he was already there, sitting at a corner table by the window, looking smaller. Not physically, but something about his posture, his expression, the way he clutched his coffee cup like a lifeline. This was not the Chase I remembered. For a while, we just sat there sipping coffee, not speaking. The silence was awkward but necessary. Finally, he broke it. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. That was the last thing I expected. Chase didn't apologize. Chase deflected, bluffed, smirked his way out of things. But this apology felt raw, unpolished. For what I asked, keeping my voice neutral. For everything he replied, meeting my gaze squarely. For mocking you. For being the golden child. For letting mom and dad's approval turn me into an asshole. For everything. I didn't rush to respond. I let his words hang in the air, because I needed to see if they were real, not performative. Then he surprised me again. "I'm lost, Ethan," he admitted. "I don't know who I am without them, without their approval." That hit harder than I expected, because it was honest, and because deep down I knew exactly what that felt like. "That's the trap," I said gently. "That's what they do to you. They make you think your value is whatever they decide it is, but it's not." His eyes shone with something close to tears, but he didn't let them fall. "How did you escape it?" he asked. I thought for a moment. "By realizing they don't get to define me anymore," I said simply. "And neither do you. No one does. You have to define yourself, Chase, for the first time in your life." He looked down at his coffee, nodding slowly, absorbing that truth like a medicine that tasted bitter but necessary. Finally, I stood up. "I hope you figure it out," I said sincerely. "I really do." And then with no anger and no finality, I simply walked away, leaving him there at the table alone, but free to make his own choices for the first time. As I stepped back into the cold, gray afternoon, I felt it for the first time fully, and finally, peace. Not victory, not revenge, just peace. But even as I walked away from that meeting, I knew there was one last conversation I needed to have, not with them, but with myself. That conversation would begin tonight. The city felt quieter than usual as I walked back from that final meeting with Chase. The air had that damp, metallic smell of impending rain, but the sky held itself in check as if even nature respected the fragile stillness I was walking through. I should have felt lighter, maybe even relieved, but what I actually felt was something quieter, deeper closure, but not peace. Not yet. There was one more reckoning left, and it wasn't with Chase or my parents or Madison or David Lang. It was with myself. That night, after Clara fell asleep, I sat alone at our kitchen table, tracing my finger around the rim of a half-empty glass of bourbon, the ice long since melted. Across the table sat a single object, the award I'd received at the gala. The crystal gleamed in the soft lamplight, heavy and sharp, perfectly designed for admiration. But I couldn't stop seeing it for what it really was, a symbol. Not just of achievement, but of survival, of endurance, of decades of clawing my way out of the shadows they had cast over me. I turned the base slowly between my hands, feeling the cool smoothness of its edges. Then I asked myself the question I'd been avoiding since the moment I walked off that ballroom stage: who am I without their rejection, without the narrative of exile and comeback? What if my identity all this time had been defined not by who I wanted to become, but by the people I was trying to prove wrong? That was the risk, now the hardest one of all. The external battles were over. The applause had died down. But inside, there was this lingering, quiet question: what would it look like to define myself without them at all? Not in contrast to them, not above them, just free. I sat there for hours watching the bourbon catch the dim light, thinking about all the symbols that had shaped my life. The burned birthday card, the photograph I'd written "not mine" on, and destroyed the Carter Resilience Fund. Even that name itself. Every time I thought I had walked away from them, I realized I was still dragging their shadow behind me, repurposing it, polishing it into something respectable. But a shadow is a shadow no matter how beautifully you carve it. I exhaled slowly and made a decision. The next morning, Clara found me sitting at the table, the award pushed aside, my laptop open, drafting a letter. "What's this?" she asked gently. I smiled genuinely this time, not the brittle kind of smile I used to wear when people asked about my family. "It's time," I said simply. "For what?" "For a clean break." She didn't ask questions. She trusted me. That was her gift. And because of that, I could trust myself enough to finally let go. The letter was simple, direct, honest. Addressed to the board of the Hayworth Foundation, it requested that the Carter Resilience Fund be renamed immediately, not to erase history, but to honor it properly. The scholarship, I wrote, should not carry a name associated with rejection and cruelty. Instead, it should honor the quiet mentors who saw me even when my family refused, to teachers, librarians, coaches, and strangers who lent dignity when it was least convenient. Rename it the Quiet Hands Scholarship for all the unseen hands that lift children up when their families fail them. It was a risk, walking away from the symbolic revenge I had crafted so carefully. But it felt right. More than that, it felt necessary. The scholarship was no longer about my past. It was about their future, the students who would benefit. It didn't need to be a monument to my pain. It could be a doorway to their freedom. That act, small on the surface, invisible to most, was the most rebellious thing I had ever done. Not burning bridges, but refusing to let those bridges define the landscape of my life. As I hit send, I felt something subtle but profound loosen inside me. A knot I hadn't realized was still there. And then the phone rang. An unknown number, but something told me I should answer. It was Aunt Sarah, my mother's estranged sister, a woman I barely remembered, but who had left the family decades ago after a bitter falling out. Her voice was careful, but clear. "I heard what happened," she said without preamble. "About the gala." "About all of it," she replied. "You did something no Carter ever has. You told the truth. You didn't just fight them. You saw them for who they were without becoming them." Her words carried a surprising weight. Sarah had walked away from the same family long before I did, but she had done it differently, quietly, without spectacle, without revenge. And she was right. The truth I had finally accepted was this: you can walk away from a toxic legacy and still carry the scars if you let them define your choices. "I thought you should know," Sarah continued after a pause. "Your parents sold the house this week. They're leaving town, starting over somewhere smaller. No farewell parties, no legacy dinners, just packing boxes and silence." That image, my mother folding her tea towels into a moving box, my father taping up the remnants of their carefully curated reputation, it was sad in a way I didn't expect. But it didn't fill me with triumph or pity, just a distant kind of compassion. They were who they were, and they would never change. I couldn't wait around hoping they would regret or redeem or even remember properly. That wasn't my work to do anymore. After we hung up, Clara and I spent the day outside, walking along the lakeshore, Oliver chasing pigeons and giggling the way only a child who has never known rejection can laugh. The wind was brisk and sharp, but I felt warm. Truly warm, not protected by armor. but open in a way I never had been. That night, I sat down next to Oliver's bed as I always did at bedtime. He was 5 now, full of big questions and boundless imagination. Tonight's question, as he nestled into his superhero comforter, was simple but profound. "Dad, what makes a family a family?" I thought carefully before answering, not because I didn't know, but because I wanted to get it right. "A family," I said slowly, "is a circle of people who choose each other, who show up, who keep each other safe even when it's hard, especially when it's hard." His little face scrunched in concentration, then relaxed into a smile. "Like Mommy, and Grandpa William, and Grandma Lily, and Uncle Vic." "Yes," I said, smiling back, "exactly like them. And like me and you," he added proudly. "Most of all," I whispered, brushing his hair back gently. "Most of all, Buddy." After he drifted off to sleep, I stayed there for a long while, watching his chest rise and fall. His little fists relaxed, his mouth slightly open. This was my legacy, not a scholarship fund, not a crystal award, not a reclaimed family name. This child, this peaceful home, this life we had built. When I finally turned out the light and closed his door, I realized that the final conversation, the one I needed to have, had just happened. It wasn't a dramatic confrontation or a monologue in a mirror. It was a quiet moment of truth that I was free, that I no longer needed to reference them at all, that my story was mine now fully and finally, and that freedom, that real, unadorned, everyday freedom, was the most valuable prize of all. Story 2. I never thought I'd dare come back to Ashbury. At 20 years old, the town felt smaller than I remembered. The streetlights still flickered at dusk. The cracked sidewalks still led to empty porches. But nothing hurt more than staring at the faded blue door of the house I once called home. My name is Elijah Parker. I'm 20 now, but when my father collapsed on our living room floor, I was just 13. A massive heart attack, they said. He was only 45, too young to leave. He was the kind of man who always showed up. Twice a week, he coached my school team. He fixed the old lawnmower. He stayed late at the hardware store so I could have extra nails for my birdhouses. When Dad died, something inside our home died with him. The photos on the walls went unchanged, but the smiles behind them vanished. My mother, Vanessa, put on a show for the neighbors. At church potlucks, she wore the perfect powder blue dress and a practiced tear when Dad's old friends raised their glasses to him. But behind closed doors, she didn't cry. She barely looked at me. In those early weeks, she forgot my school play. She missed my birthday dinner. I remember the sting of that empty chair at the table, the way I pushed my peas around my plate until they formed a tiny mountain. If I tried to complain, she called me ungrateful. "Your father's gone," she'd say. "Stop being so dramatic." The small neglects grew into something uglier. She snapped at me for leaving my shoes in the hallway. She stormed into my room and tossed my drawings in the trash. She deleted my messages on the landline and then told me nobody ever called. If I woke up late, she'd slam the bathroom door so hard it rattled the walls. For every breath I took, it felt like I owed her permission. I tried to protect the memory of my dad by clinging to his old toolbox in the garage. I'd sit on the lawn, opening each drawer, tracing the outlines of wrenches with my fingertips. The smell of motor oil was the only thing that made me feel close to him. One night, I drifted off asleep, sitting there, and woke to find the box gone. Vanessa told me it was clutter, and clutter had to go. Then came the trip. She woke me before dawn with a packed bag and a one-word explanation: "Come." We drove for hours past the city limits into a stretch of rust-colored fields. I asked where we were going. She only said, "Somewhere quiet." We pulled into a deserted gas station with a broken neon sign. She told me to get out, zipped open her leather glove, and shut the door. I stood there in my sneakers and a thin jacket as her car slipped away. I pressed my palm to the cold window. I thought maybe she'd circle back. I thought maybe she'd come around the pump and wave. But the engine's hum faded into nothing. When the sun climbed high and the pumps still whispered silence, I realized she had left me. I sat on the curb for hours clutching my bag. My legs trembled. I stared at a single gas pump that hadn't worked since the 80s. The clerk inside watched me through the glass, then locked the door and turned off the lights. He didn't open, even when I pounded. I tried to sleep leaning against the wall, but the cement was too hard and the insects too loud. By midnight, I was so cold I could see my own breath. My bag had a pair of socks, one shirt, and a paperback my dad had given me, The Hobbit. I opened it for comfort, read the same paragraph over and over until the words blurred. I told myself this was a test, that she wanted to toughen me up. But that lie didn't hold for long. I was alone, scared, and hungry. Dawn came slowly. I flagged down a trucker named Joe who let me ride to the next town in exchange for sweeping his rig's cab. I washed my face in a public bathroom with paper towels. My bruises from the night before were faint, just like I needed. I decided I'd try to find work, anything, and save up for a phone card. I'd call my aunt. I had her number memorized. Aunt Clarissa had always been kind. Maybe she'd help. Over the next weeks, I learned a new rhythm: early mornings, hustling at construction sites, afternoons, hiding in library stalls, nights, catching 20-minute naps on benches behind loading docks. I met Leah, a girl 2 years older, who slipped me extra fries from the diner where she worked. She called herself a permanent transit case. I called her friend. I met Marcus, an ex-cop turned social worker who slipped me hand-me-down jackets and listened without judgment. I mapped out shelters and safe spots. I borrowed books from strangers. I learned to shave with a rusty razor in a laundromat. And I vowed that one day I'd come back for what was mine to face Vanessa and show her the truth she tried to bury. Tonight, I stand in front of that broken blue door bag slung over my shoulder, heart pounding. My hands are steady now. I've rehearsed what I'll say. The will that named me sole heir. The bank statements that show every withdrawal she made. The photos of me growing up that she tossed in the trash. I don't know how she'll react. Maybe she'll cry the same empty tears. Maybe she'll deny everything. Maybe she'll lash out the way she always did. But I'm not the scared kid she left behind. I have allies now: Leah, Marcus, Aunt Clarissa, and even that gas station clerk who won't look away. I have proof, and I have a voice. Tomorrow, I'll knock on that door again. And this time, I won't leave until she listens. I woke before sunrise, the city still yawning in pale light, and for the first time in years, I didn't dread the day I welcomed it. I dressed quickly, breathing into my shoulders to calm the tremor in my hands. Clutched under my arm was the tattered family Bible, its pages so worn Dad's handwriting had almost faded. That book had been our silent witness to every promise he made to me, and now it would stand witness to every lie Mom spun behind closed doors. I headed to Aunt Clarissa's bookstore, that cramped haven of dusty shelves and whispered confidences. When she saw me, her eyes brimmed with that soft concern that had always felt like a warm blanket. I slid my folder across her oak desk, the real Will bank ledgers stained with her withdrawals and the stack of forged school newsletters she'd sent around town. Clarissa's lips pressed into a determined line as she thumbed the pages, then looked up at me and said, "You're braver than you know." In that moment, doubt and hope tangled inside me. Was I truly ready to strike at the heart of her perfect lie? The courthouse loomed next its marble facade, glowing in the morning sun like a judge's robe. Inside, I felt the old fear rise, fear that the law might not see me as more than a runaway kid making wild accusations. I clutched my folder tight and navigated the echoing halls to the clerk's window, where a bored official glanced at my papers. Her pencil paused as she read the title, Petition for Recovery of Estate Funds. Around me, lawyers strutted in tailored suits, their briefcases gleaming. They moved with the assumed knowledge that justice was their birthright. I pressed forward anyway, sliding each document across the counter, the codicil, naming me sole heir, the notarized affidavit from Uncle Joe, the proof of property sale well below market value. When the clerk stamped my copies and handed them back, the thunk of each seal felt like a small victory. But as I left the building, I wondered whether this victory would survive a courtroom full of people who had bought Mom's story hook, line, and sinker. I drifted into the plaza outside where a wrought iron fountain sprayed icy water into the cool air. Pigeons fluttered at its edges, scavenging for crumbs tossed by tourists in designer coats. I opened the Bible and read aloud a verse Dad had underlined. "Let truth spring up from the earth." My voice sounded hollow against the stones. Around me, life barreled on. Office workers rushed to lunch. A street preacher hollered about sin and salvation, and a homeless man curled under a blanket, invisible to everyone. I closed the book, pressing it to my chest. The contrast burned the fountain's polished metal, the shine of someone else's shoes, the harsh glare of the spotlight on the smallest voices. If justice was a stage, I was the uninvited actor stepping into the glare. And yet the same page that comforted me also reminded me that confronting my mother would demand more than courage. It would demand relentless faith in my own worth. Late afternoon found me back on Maple Avenue facing the Parker residence. The house was postcard-perfect, trimmed hedges, identical mailboxes, even a fresh pot of chrysanthemums on the front steps. I tucked the Bible and court papers into my jacket pockets and rang the bell. The chime echoed through the quiet hallway as I imagined every family photo lining the walls, each one a carefully crafted lie. The door opened before I could knock a second time. Mom stood there in her pastel cardigan, that practiced smile in place. She welcomed me inside with the ease of a seasoned actress. My heart pounded so hard I thought she'd hear it. Still, I stepped over the threshold, determined not to flinch. As the door clicked shut behind me, I realized that once I spoke, there would be no turning back. In the living room, Mom motioned me to a plush armchair and poured tea with hands that trembled ever so slightly. I set my folder on the coffee table. Its weight felt heavier than my duffel bag of old clothes. I watched her eyes flicker from the Bible propped beside the lamp to the stack of documents. "Why are you here?" she asked, her voice steady, but her fingers tightening around the teacup. I let the silence stretch, then laid out each charge, the drained savings meant for my education, the forged letters sent to our relatives the house sold off for far less than it was worth. With each revelation, her posture slackened, her mask cracking. I expected outrage tears, maybe even a confession. Instead, she pressed her lips into a thin line and whispered, "You don't know the half of it." Her words hit me like a fist. The twist I hadn't seen coming, she hinted at a secret I'd never imagined, a hidden ledger indicating other players in this deception. A flash of dread shot through me. Was there someone else pulling her strings? A trustee who overlooked the will. A family friend I trusted. As she lifted her teacup to her lips, the steam curling around her face blurred the lines between victim and villain. I realized then that exposing her was only the start of a deeper unraveling, and that the next move might reveal more truth than I bargained for. I slipped out of the house before dawn, carrying the weight of Mom's confession, in every step the old family Bible tucked under my arm like a shield. The sky was bruised purple when I reached the courthouse again, but this time I wasn't filing papers. I was hunting for the trustee, Mr. Albright, the man whose name Mom had whispered over her trembling teacup. His office was in a glass tower downtown, its mirrored surface reflecting a city that moved on without me. I paused at the revolving door, took a breath, and reminded myself that fear had no claim on me anymore. Inside, I followed the marble floors to Suite 1204. Albright's secretary gave me a polite nod, but her eyes flicked to my threadbare jacket and the Bible peeking from my satchel. When I asked to see him, she hesitated, tapping at her keyboard, then said, "He has a meeting. Can you wait?" I nodded, even though every second felt like a gamble. In the lobby, I opened the Bible to Dad's bookmarked passage about truth shining like a lamp. I recited it quietly until Albright's sleek silhouette appeared at the elevator. My pulse thundered. Would he see me as a desperate kid with wild accusations, or as the sole heir he once swore was protected? The elevator doors closed on my reflection, and his expectant glance leaving me suspended between past betrayal and the risk of uncovering more. Albright's office smelled of leather and old secrets. He sat behind a walnut desk, the morning sun catching the silver in his temples. He gestured to a leather chair that didn't match mine, worn, stained, the kind of chair that remembered overnight visitors. I placed the Bible and court-stamped documents on his desk without a word. His brow furrowed as he sorted through the pages. "Ms. Parker told me you'd be coming," he said softly, almost kindly. "She said you didn't understand how complex this was." I swallowed down the urge to call him liar, and instead asked for an explanation why he'd signed off on every forged newsletter, every property appraisal that shaved tens of thousands off my inheritance. Albright's eyes flickered to the Bible's cracked spine, and he sighed. "Your mother was desperate," he said. "She convinced me that the funds were needed for your safety education travel experiences she claimed you requested." His voice was calm, but I felt a surge of anger. The risk I'd taken to get here boiled in my veins. As he leaned back, he slid a single sheet of paper across the desk. "There's more," he whispered. "Look at page 2. My fingers trembled as I lifted the corner and saw a different ledger, one that named Pastor Henry and a shadowy shell company. The actors in this drama were multiplying, and the next move would force me to decide whom I could trust. I left the tower clutching the folded ledger like a lifeline and raced to St. Mark's Church, where Pastor Henry's gravel voice had once soothed our grief. The stained glass windows glowed with dawn's promise, scenes of mercy and sacrifice that felt almost mocking in the harsh light of betrayal. Inside, the pews sat empty except for dust and echoes. I found him in the vestry, thumb through hymnals. His eyes widened when I slid the ledger across the wooden table. "Elijah," he said, his voice low, "you shouldn't be here." I demanded to know why he'd endorsed my mother's lies, why he'd opened an account under a fake name, funneled money from my college fund into silent pockets. Henry closed his eyes as though he were bearing a crucifix's weight. When he spoke, his words trembled. "I believed it was for your own good. Your mother said you were vulnerable, that without her plan you'd fall through the cracks. I wanted to protect you." I pictured him in my childhood, tall and comforting at my father's funeral, reciting scripture about redemption. Now his hands shook on the ledger. I pressed on. "So you stole from me?" He hesitated, then nodded. I thought I was answering a higher calling. The clash of my faith in him and this act of deceit hit me like a thunderclap. As he stared at me with remorse, I realized that forgiveness would be harder than vengeance, and that the next page of this ledger held a name I never expected to see. Unfolding the ledger on a chipped kitchen table in Tommy's cramped apartment, I traced the columns of dates and dollar amounts. There, in looping script, was the name C.L. Bookkeeping, my aunt's small business, the one Aunt Clarissa had used to help the neighborhood literacy drive. My pulse throbbed so loudly, I thought the walls would shake. Clarissa, who had wiped my tears and encouraged me to fight, was listed as a beneficiary on the very payments that drained my inheritance. I slammed my fist on the table, scattering ledger pages like confetti of betrayal. Every memory of her kindness twisted into suspicion, the quiet nods of support at the courthouse, the sympathetic sigh when I showed her the forged newsletters. I felt my world shift off its axis. If she'd known, if she'd profited, then who else had I trusted blindly? My phone buzzed, Uncle Joe's name flashing. He'd heard about my late-night visit to Pastor Henry. I hesitated, torn between confronting Clarissa first or seeking his counsel. My heart pounded in my ears, and I realized the true risk exposing my aunt could shatter the only family bond I'd held onto. And yet, I couldn't ignore the proof beneath my shaking fingertips. With a breath that tasted like tears and steel, I texted Joe. "Meet me at the bookstore in 1 hour, alone." As I hit send, the room spun. and I knew there was no turning back from the truth I was about to unearth. I met Uncle Joe inside Aunt Clarissa's bookstore just as daylight filtered through the rain-speckled windows, turning dust motes into drifting stars. His face was drawn, the weight of my late-night message evident in the way he rubbed his temples before I even spoke. I laid the ledger on Clarissa's battered oak desk, its pages spread like evidence in a crime scene. She stood behind stacks of half-read novels, her eyes red but defiant. I forced myself to keep my voice steady as I recounted Pastor Henry's confession, then pointed to her name in looping ink. Clarissa's breath caught in her throat, and she sank onto a stool as though the floor had opened beneath her. For a moment, the three of us were suspended in shock, the musty air thick with betrayal. Then she reached out and touched the Bible I'd left on the counter, its cracked spine echoing the fracture in our family's faith. "I did it to save you," she whispered, voice trembling. "I thought I was protecting you from a world that'd chew you up." Her words landed like shards of glass against my armor of anger, and I realized exposing her meant confronting not just her choices, but the very love I'd once believed safe. Could I condemn the one person who'd first offered me shelter when Mom drove me away? The fight inside me roared as I watched Clarissa's tears stain the ledger. Aunt Clarissa, the gentle champion of reader gatherings and literacy drives, had diverted thousands of dollars meant for my education into anonymous community scholarships. She'd believed, truly believed, that Dad's savings belonged to the entire neighborhood of struggling kids, that my need for survival had already been met by life's harsh lessons. The symbol of the open book in her logo suddenly felt mocking, a promise of knowledge that came at the price of my inheritance. Uncle Joe cleared his throat, reminding me gently that I could choose to forgive her or to press charges for breach of fiduciary duty. The idea of punishing her felt savage, like punishing a mother for feeding stray kittens in the alley. Yet letting her actions go unchallenged felt equally wrong. If I spared her now, I would betray the truth I'd fought so hard to uncover. My pulse thundered in my ears, and the hush of the bookstore seemed to lean in, waiting for my choice. In that pregnant silence, I realized the next step would define not just my case, but the moral compass I carried into my future. That afternoon, armed with fresh affidavits from Pastor Henry and the Shell Company records, I returned to the courthouse, each step across the marble floor echoing against my doubts. I filed an amended petition naming Clarissa and Pastor Henry as co-defendants alongside my mother. Every stamped copy I carried felt heavier than the last, as though each signature etched another layer of responsibility onto my conscience. Outside umbrellas bobbed across the plaza as thunderclouds gathered an omen, or perhaps just a coincidence. I tucked the Bible into my jacket pocket, its presence a reminder that justice and mercy often conflict like thunder and lightning. As I handed the documents to the clerk, I wondered whether the judiciary would see these additional names as collateral damage or as rightful accountability. If I pursued them all, would I unravel the family safety net I'd so painfully pieced together? And if I held back, would I betray the principles I'd recited by that fountain months ago? Rain began to patter against the glass dome above, and I felt time fracture between what needed to be done and what I yearned to forgive. In the courtroom the next week, the air was thick with formality, the judge's gavel looming like a hammer over my fate. I sat between Uncle Joe and Clarissa, watching her clasp and unclasp her hands as the proceedings unfolded. Her lawyer argued that she'd acted under duress, guided by Mom's calculated deceptions and Pastor Henry's moral authority. When Clarissa took the stand, she held the Bible I'd carried in her shaking hands, her voice steady despite tear tracks. She told the court she'd believed my father left that money in trust for community upliftment, that each scholarship paid forward his belief in hard work and compassion. As she spoke, I caught the judge's eye. His narrow gaze flicked between her trembling lips and my resolute posture. In that moment, I felt both respect for her courage and the sorrow of betrayal. When it was my turn, I spoke plainly. I honored her generosity, but insisted that my father's intent, recorded in ink and notarized, was clear. He named me heir, entrusted me with the home he built, and designated funds solely for my future. My final words hung in the air. Love can't overwrite a will. The gavel fell, not in judgment, but in anticipation our next hearing would decide who truly held my father's legacy. And as I stood to leave, I realized that exposing the truth had cost me more than I knew, and that the verdict would determine whether my shattered family could ever be whole again or if the fractures would become permanent scars.